What happened to boys who were left behind? In the old city of Rome, there were many boys who had no home. Some were born into big families that could not take care of them. Others came from places far away and were left behind when their parents went somewhere else. These boys were not wanted by those who gave them life, so they were put in baskets or wrapped in cloth and placed near roads, under trees, or by the sides of buildings where people might find them. The sun would rise and fall many times while these boys waited. Sometimes a kind person would see them and pick them up. Other times, animals came close but did not help. The wind would blow over them and the rain would fall on their small bodies. They did not know why they were there or what would happen next. They only knew cold, hunger, and silence. Most of the time, these boys were found by men who worked with their hands. Some were farmers who needed help in the fields. Others were builders who made walls and roofs for houses. A few were traders who moved through the streets selling things like bread, oil, or cloth. These men saw the boys and thought they could be useful. They did not always have love in their hearts, but they had work to do. Once taken in, the boys were given new names or no names at all. Some were called Little One or Boy. Others were told to keep quiet and never speak unless asked. They slept in corners, under tables, or on pieces of cloth near the fire. They ate scraps of food that were left after others had eaten. Their days began before the sun came up and ended long after it went down. There was no school for them. There were no books to read or letters to learn. Their lessons came from watching others and doing what they were told. If they made mistakes, they were hit or sent outside with nothing to eat. If they worked well, they were given more work. This was how they grew, not with love, but with tired eyes and sore feet. Some boys tried to run away. They thought maybe their real parents were still out there. But most of them did not get far. Roads were long and dangerous. Wolves lived in the forests and strangers did not help boys who had no money. Those who ran were often caught and brought back. They were told again that they belonged here now, even if they did not want to. Life for these boys was simple and slow. Each day looked much like the last. They carried water, cleaned floors, fed animals, and picked fruit from trees. They learned how to move quietly and not make noise when others were sleeping. They watched how grown-ups talked and tried to copy them, but they were not allowed to talk too much themselves. There were no parties for them. No music, no dancing, no gifts. They watched from a distance as other children played in the streets. They saw girls wearing soft clothes and boys with wooden toys. They did not cry. Crying made the grown-ups angry. Instead, they turned back to their work and tried not to think about what they could not have. As they got older, they became stronger. Their arms grew and their backs stood straighter. They could carry heavier things and walk longer distances. They were no longer seen as babies, but they were still not seen as people. They were tools like hammers or buckets. They were used for work and then put aside when the day was done. The city of Rome was loud and full of people. It had temples with tall columns and markets with many smells. There were fountains that poured water and statues that looked like gods. But for these boys, the city was just a place they walked through while carrying something heavy. They did not look around much. They kept their heads down and their feet moving. Some of the boys were lucky. They were taken by men who were not cruel. These men gave them warm clothes and let them sleep inside. They did not hit them very often and sometimes said kind words. But even with kindness, the boys were still not free. They could not choose where to go or what to do. Their lives were not their own. Other boys were not so lucky. They were taken by men who drank wine and shouted late into the night. These men gave them little food and made them work until they could not stand. They were told to stay quiet and never ask questions. If they did, they were punished in ways that made them remember not to speak again. It was hard to know what would happen next. Would the man who took them in stay healthy? Would he grow old and pass them on to someone else? Or would he die suddenly and leave them alone once more? These thoughts came to the boys sometimes, but they did not speak them out loud. Thinking was easier than talking. The sky above Rome was wide and blue during the day. At night, it was black and filled with stars. The boys looked up at the stars sometimes, wondering if anyone else was looking at them too. They did not know if their real mothers or fathers ever thought about them. They did not know if they had brothers or sisters. All they knew was the life they had now. This was how the boys started. Not with joy or songs, but with silence and waiting. They were left behind, found by chance, and given a life of work and quiet days. They did not ask for much. They did not expect much. And so, they went on one step at a time, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. How these boys lived when they were small. The days of the boys were long and quiet. They woke up before the sun came up and went to sleep long after it was gone. The light came slowly in the morning, and the boys would sit up from where they had slept. Sometimes it was on the floor, sometimes on a small pile of cloth, and sometimes on a wooden shelf built into the wall. They did not have soft beds or warm covers. They used what they were given, and they did not complain. The man who had taken them in would call them by a name, or sometimes just by a sound like a cluck or a snap of the fingers. The boys knew when to come. They walked with bare feet across the cold floor and stood near the door or the fire. They were given a small piece of bread or a spoon of porridge. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them moving. The first thing they did was bring water. They went to the well or the fountain and filled the bucket. The bucket was heavy and hard to carry, but they held it with both hands and walked slowly back. If they spilled some, they were told to go again. If they did not spill, they were told to go faster next time. There was no way to be right. They just kept doing it day after day. Then they swept the floor. They used a bundle of sticks tied together to push the dust into the corners. They did not always do it well, but they did it for a long time. They were told to do it again if the man was not happy. They did not argue. They just did it again. The animals needed food and water too. The chickens had to be fed, the goats had to be milked, and the pigs had to be given scraps. The boys learned how to do these things by watching and by doing. If they did not learn fast enough, they were hit. If they did learn, they were given more work. There was no praise, only more things to do. They ate again at midday. It was not much different from the morning. A piece of bread, a small bowl of soup, or a few pieces of fruit if it was the season. They sat on the ground or on a low stone. They did not talk much. Talking was not allowed unless they were asked a question. So they ate in silence and looked at the ground. After eating, they went back to work. They carried wood, cleaned tools, or watched over the animals. They walked in the sun and got hot. They walked in the shade and got cold. Their clothes were worn and torn. They were given what was left from others. Sometimes it fit, sometimes it did not. They wore it anyway. They had no toys. They had no games. They watched the other children play from a distance. They did not go near them. They were not invited. They did not ask. They just watched and went back to their work. The man who had taken them in was not always kind. He was not always mean either. He was just there. He gave them orders and watched them work. He did not talk to them much. He did not ask how they felt. He did not care if they were tired or sore. He only cared if the work was done. At night, they sat near the fire and watched the flames. The man drank wine and spoke to others. The boys did not speak. They listened and tried to understand the words. Some of the words were hard. Some of them were not. They did not ask what they meant. They just listened. They did not have stories read to them. They did not have songs sung to them. They had silence and the sound of the wind. They looked at the sky and saw the stars. They did not know the names of the stars. They did not know what they meant. They just looked and thought, even if they did not say what they thought. They went to sleep in the same place they woke up. They curled up and closed their eyes. They did not dream much. When they did, they dreamed of work and silence. They dreamed of carrying water and sweeping floors. They dreamed of walking and not stopping. This was how they lived when they were small. Not with joy, not with sadness, but with quiet and work. They did not ask for more. They did not expect more. They just kept going one day at a time. Who took care of the boys and why? The boys were taken in by many kinds of men. Some were old and slow, others were young and strong. Some lived alone, others had families of their own. The boys did not know why they were chosen. They only knew that someone saw them and decided to bring them home. Most of the time, it was a man who needed help. He might have been a farmer who worked the land from morning until night. He grew wheat or barley and kept goats or chickens. He could not do all the work alone. His back hurt, his hands were sore, and he needed someone small to run errands or watch the animals. When he found a boy, he brought him in without much thought. Other times, the man was a worker in the city. He built walls, fixed roofs, or made tools out of metal. He had no sons of his own, or his sons had grown up and left. He needed someone to carry things for him, to sweep the floor, to clean the tools when the day was done. A boy was easy to train and did not ask for much. There were also men who ran small shops. They sold bread, oil, or cloth. They needed someone to stand behind the counter and hand things to customers. They needed someone to sweep the floor and close the shutters at night. A boy could learn to do this with time and practice. Some of the men were soldiers who had come back from far places. They had fought in battles and seen many things. Now they lived quietly and wanted less noise, not more. But they still needed help around the house. A boy could be useful for simple tasks like fetching water or feeding the dog. A few of the men were priests who served in temples. They did not live with families, but they still needed help. Someone had to light the candles, sweep the steps, and bring fresh flowers to the statues of the gods. A quiet boy who did not speak too much was just right for this kind of life. There were also men who were not kind. These men took boys for other reasons. They made them work very hard and gave them little food. They did not care if the boys were tired or cold. They only cared if the work was done on time. These men often lived in small houses near the edge of town. Their homes were dark and smelled of old smoke and wet clothes. The boys who lived there woke up early and went to sleep late. They did not talk much. Talking was not allowed unless they were asked a question. Some of the boys were given to rich men. These men had big houses and many workers. They did not take the boys themselves, but they told someone else to find a boy and bring him in. The boys became servants in large homes. They cleaned floors, carried trays, and stood quietly while others ate. Life with these men was different. The food was better, and the clothes were warmer. But the rules were strict. The boys could not speak unless spoken to. They could not look people in the eye. They could not leave the house unless told to go somewhere. They were watched all the time. Not all the men were the same. Some were gentle and spoke in soft voices. Others were loud and angry. Most were somewhere in between. They were not cruel, but they were not kind either. They gave the boys a place to sleep and something to eat, but not much more than that. The boys did not ask questions about why they were taken in. They did not wonder if the man liked them or not. They only knew that they had a place now. It was not always a good place, but it was a place, and that was better than nothing. They learned to follow orders quickly. They learned to move without making noise. They learned to keep their heads down and their mouths closed. They did not cry when they were hit. They did not smile when they were praised. They just kept working day after day. Sometimes the man would get sick. Then the boys had to do even more. They brought medicine, cleaned the room, and waited by the bed. If the man got better, he went back to work. If he did not, the boys were given to someone else. Sometimes the man would die. Then the boys were sent away. They were told they could not stay anymore. They packed what little they had and walked out the door. They did not know where they were going. They only knew they had to go. Some of them were lucky again. Another man found them and gave them a new home. Some were not so lucky. They had to sleep outside and find food wherever they could. They begged, they stole, they waited to be found once more. But most of the time, the boys stayed with the same man for many years. They grew taller and stronger. They learned how to do more things. They were trusted with more work. They were no longer seen as small boys, but they were still not seen as men. This was how they lived, not with love, not with hate, but with silence and patience. They did what they were told. They went where they were sent, and they waited for the next day to come. The things the boys did as they grew up. As the boys grew older, they started to do more work. When they were small, they only carried small things and cleaned small spaces. But now they were taller and stronger. Their arms could hold heavier buckets. Their legs could walk longer roads. Their backs could carry more wood. The man who had taken them in gave them new tasks. Some of the boys worked in the fields. They pulled weeds from between rows of crops. They dug holes for planting seeds. They stood in the sun for many hours and did not sit down until the day was done. Other boys stayed in the house or shop. They swept the floors again and again. They washed dishes with water that was sometimes warm and sometimes cold. They polished tables and dusted shelves. If there were customers, they watched them but did not speak unless told to. In the city, some boys worked with traders. They helped load carts with goods like fruit, bread, or cloth. They walked beside the carts as they moved through the streets. They called out to people, saying what was for sale and how much it cost. They learned to speak clearly and slowly so others could understand. Some of the boys worked near the docks. The ships came in every day and needed help unloading. The boys carried baskets full of fish, oil, or grain from the boats to the shore. Their hands became rough and calloused from the ropes and baskets. Their clothes got wet from the sea air and stayed damp most of the time. They woke up earlier than before. The days were long and the work never seemed to end. They were given a small piece of bread in the morning and another at midday. At night, there was soup or stew made from whatever was left. It was not always warm, but it filled their stomachs enough to keep going. There were no breaks for play. There were no holidays when they could rest. Every day was the same. Work in the morning, work in the afternoon, and more work at night if needed. The man who watched over them did not smile often. He only nodded if the work was done well. If it was not done well, he said nothing. He just gave them more work the next day. The boys did not talk about what they wanted to do when they were older. They did not dream of becoming soldiers, merchants, or teachers. Those jobs were for boys who had families and names. These boys had no names that mattered. They were known by what they could do, not by who they were. Sometimes they saw other boys their age walking with their fathers. The other boys wore clean clothes and had soft shoes. They laughed and ran ahead while their fathers followed behind. The foundling boys watched from a distance and kept working. They did not ask questions. They did not want to know why life was different for them. They learned to move quietly. They learned to listen without being seen. They learned to stand still when someone important walked by. They did not look up. They did not speak. They waited until they were told what to do next. When it rained, they worked in the rain. When it was hot, they worked in the heat. When it was cold, they worked with stiff fingers and sore feet. They did not complain. Complaining led to silence or punishment, so they stayed quiet and kept moving. Some of the boys were good at what they did. They could carry heavy loads without dropping them. They could sweep a floor until it looked clean. They could tell when a customer wanted something and bring it before being asked. These boys were given more work instead of less. Being good meant doing more. Others were slower. They took longer to finish tasks. They spilled water or dropped tools. They forgot what they were told. These boys were hit or sent outside with no food. They were reminded that work must be done and done right. The boys did not have friends among themselves. They lived under the same roof but did not talk much. They did not share stories or dreams. They did not sit together after work. Each boy had his own thoughts, but none of them were spoken aloud. At night, they sat near the fire and watched the flames. The man drank wine and talked with others. The boys listened and tried to understand the words. Sometimes they closed their eyes and let the sound of voices fill the room. They did not speak. They did not ask questions. They just listened. They went to sleep in the same place they had slept the night before. They curled up on the floor or in a corner. They used the same cloth or blanket they had used for many nights. It was worn and thin, but it kept them warm enough. They dreamed of walking, of carrying things, of sweeping floors. They dreamed of standing still and waiting. They dreamed of silence and footsteps. They did not wake up smiling. They did not wake up sad. They just woke up and began again. This was how the boys grew up, not with joy or sadness, but with quiet and work. They did not choose this life. They simply lived it, one day at a time with no end in sight. Where the boys went when they got older. As the boys grew into young men, they no longer looked like the small children who had once been left by the road or found near the market. Their bodies changed. Their arms became thicker and their shoulders wider. Their voices deepened and they spoke less than before. They moved with slower steps and carried more weight without complaint. The man who had taken them in no longer saw them as boys who needed watching. He gave them more work and fewer reminders. He told them what to do once and expected it to be done without asking again. If they forgot something, he did not say much. He just gave them more to do the next day. Some of the young men stayed where they were. They continued working for the same man in the same place. The farmer still needed help in the fields. The shopkeeper still needed someone to sweep and carry. The builder still needed hands to lift and hammer. The young men knew how to do these things well. They did not need to learn anything new. Others were sent away when they got too big or too quiet. The man who had raised them said there was no more room or that he could not feed another mouth. Sometimes he said nothing at all. He just handed them a cloth with some bread inside and pointed toward the road. The young men took what they were given and walked away without looking back. They walked through the city streets and past the walls of Rome. They went from one place to another, looking for work. Some found jobs with other farmers. Others worked for traders who sold oil, wine, or cloth. A few joined groups of workers who built roads or cleaned canals. They did whatever they were told to do. They slept where they could, sometimes in barns, sometimes under trees, and sometimes in empty corners of buildings. They wrapped themselves in the same cloth they had used since they were boys. It was worn and thin, but it kept them warm enough when the night air was cool. They ate when they could find food. They carried water for people in exchange for a piece of bread. They swept floors for a bowl of soup. They helped move boxes for a handful of figs. They did not ask for much. They only asked for enough to keep going. They met other men who had also grown up without families. These men did not talk much either. They sat together near fires and watched the flames. They drank water or weak wine and said nothing for long periods of time. They did not tell stories about where they came from. No one asked. No one wanted to know. The city of Rome was loud and full of people. There were temples with tall columns and markets filled with smells of bread, meat, and spices. There were fountains that poured water and statues that looked like gods. But for these young men, the city was just another place to walk through while carrying something heavy. They did not look around much. They kept their heads down and their feet moving. They passed by shops where boys played with wooden toys. They saw girls wearing soft clothes and men with clean tunics. They did not stop to watch. They did not want to be noticed. Sometimes they were hired for longer work. A builder needed help lifting stones. A trader needed someone to ride with him to the next town. A soldier needed a helper to carry his shield and sword. These jobs lasted days or weeks. The young men did them quietly and without complaint. When the work was done, they were given a small amount of money or a few pieces of food. They did not spend it on fine things. They bought more bread, a new piece of cloth, or a pair of worn sandals. They did not go to shows or festivals. They did not buy wine or perfume. They only bought what they needed to keep going. At night, they sat near fires and stared at the sky. The stars were the same ones they had seen when they were boys. They wondered if anyone else looked at them too. They thought about the places they had been and the things they had done. But they did not speak out loud. Thinking was easier than talking. They did not dream of becoming rich or famous. Those dreams were for others. They only dreamed of walking, of working, of staying warm at night. They dreamed of carrying things and sweeping floors. They dreamed of silence and footsteps. They woke up and began again. Some of them were lucky. They found steady work with kind men. They were given a place to sleep and regular meals. They were not hit often. They were not shouted at. They lived quiet lives with little joy and little sadness. Others were not so lucky. They moved from job to job and place to place. They slept outside when it rained. They went hungry when there was no work. They walked long roads with sore feet and tired backs. They did not complain. Complaining led to silence or punishment. There was no end to this life. There was no sign that things would change. Each day looked much like the last. Work in the morning, rest at night, and silence in between. They did not expect more. They did not ask for more. They simply kept going one step at a time. This was where the boys went when they grew older. Not to great cities or rich homes. Not to war or glory. Just to quiet places and slow days. They walked the same roads they had walked before, only now they carried heavier loads and wore older clothes. And so they went on, with no name, no home, and no story to tell. The jobs that most foundling men had. Most of the men who had been found as boys did not have many choices about what they could do for work. They were not taught to read or write. They were not trained to become doctors, teachers, or merchants. Their lives were shaped by what others needed them to do. And so they did those things day after day without much thought. One of the most common jobs was working in the fields. These men rose early and went to bed late. They worked under the sun when it was hot and under the clouds when it was cold. They pulled weeds, planted seeds, and carried baskets full of fruit or grain. Their hands became rough from holding tools. Their backs ached from bending over for long hours. But they kept going because there was no other choice. They worked for farmers who owned land outside the city. These farmers gave them small meals and a place to sleep near the animals. The men slept on straw or on wooden shelves built into the walls. They did not complain. They simply lay down and closed their eyes until morning came again. Another common job was helping with construction. Rome was always building something: roads, houses, temples, and walls. There was always a need for strong hands to carry stones, mix mud, and lift heavy beams. These men worked from sunrise to sunset. They wore simple tunics that got dirty and torn. They drank water from shared bowls and ate bread that was sometimes soft and sometimes hard. They followed orders from builders who shouted instructions. If a man did not move fast enough, he was told to go faster next time. If he dropped something, he was told to pick it up and keep going. There was no praise, only silence or more work. These men did not talk much while they worked. Talking slowed them down. Silence made the day pass quicker. Some of the men worked in markets. They helped traders sell oil, wine, cloth, and bread. They stood behind tables and watched people walk by. They called out what was for sale and how much it cost. Some customers were kind. Others were loud and angry. The men learned to smile when someone bought something and to stay quiet when someone walked away. They cleaned the tables at night and packed the goods into boxes. They locked the shutters and made sure nothing was left outside. Then they went home to small rooms above the shops or to corners behind the market stalls. They wrapped themselves in old cloths and listened to the sounds of the city before falling asleep. A few of the men worked near the docks. Ships came in every day carrying fish, grain, and other goods from far places. These men unloaded the ships and carried baskets to storage houses. Their clothes were often wet from the sea air. Their feet were sore from walking on wet wood. They worked in all kinds of weather: rain, wind, and sun. They did not ask for better conditions. They just kept moving. They ate food that was given to them by the traders or ship workers. Sometimes it was warm soup. Sometimes it was dry bread and cheese. They sat on crates or on the ground while they ate. They did not talk much. They looked at the sky or at the ships and thought about nothing in particular. Other men became helpers to soldiers. They carried weapons, cleaned armor, and set up tents when the army camped. They followed the soldiers from one place to another. They walked long roads and slept under the stars. They did not fight. They only helped. They were given food and a small space to sleep near the fire. They watched the soldiers train and play games. They saw them drink wine and tell stories around the fire. The men did not join in. They stayed quiet and waited to be told what to do next. When the army moved again, they packed up and followed without complaint. Some of the men worked in homes as servants. They swept floors, carried water, and cleaned tables for rich families. They wore clean tunics but spoke very little. They did not look at the people they served. They kept their heads down and their hands busy. They were given small rooms to sleep in and small portions to eat. It was better than sleeping outside, but not by much. They did not make friends among the other servants. They did not share dreams or memories. They only worked and waited. If someone asked them a question, they answered quietly. If no one asked, they stayed silent. They knew that being seen too much was not good. Being useful without being noticed was best. There were also men who worked alone. They collected wood, dug holes, or cleaned streets. They did not work for anyone in particular. They took whatever jobs they could find. Some days there was work. Other days there was none. When there was none, they sat near walls or under trees and waited for someone to call them over. They begged for food when they had no money. They traded pieces of cloth for bits of bread. They did not smile much. Smiling made others think they were weak. They kept their faces still and their eyes low. They walked slowly through the city with nothing in their pockets and nothing in their minds. These men did not dream of becoming leaders or heroes. Those dreams were for boys who had families and names. These men only dreamed of walking, of working, of staying warm at night. They dreamed of silence and footsteps. They woke up and began again. Each day was like the last. Work in the morning, rest at night, and quiet in between. They did not expect more. They did not ask for more. They simply kept going one step at a time with no end in sight. This was the life of most foundling men. Not with joy, not with sadness, but with silence and patience. They did what they were told. They went where they were sent, and they waited for the next day to come. How people saw them in the city and around town. The men who had once been found as boys were not seen the same way as others in the city. They walked through the streets like everyone else, but they did not speak like everyone else. They wore clothes that were worn and sometimes torn. Their tunics were patched with bits of cloth and tied with string. Their sandals had holes in the soles and made soft sounds when they walked. People saw them but did not look at them for long. They were not rich. They did not wear fine fabrics or carry gold rings on their fingers. They did not ride in carts or walk with guards behind them. They were just men who moved from place to place, doing what needed to be done. Some people knew where they came from. They had heard stories about boys left by the road or taken in by kind or not so kind men. But those stories were old. They were told quietly and not often. Most people did not think much about it. The past was the past. What mattered now was what a man could do. When someone needed help, they called for these men. A farmer needed extra hands during harvest time. A builder needed someone to carry stones. A trader needed someone to watch his stall while he went away for a short time. These men were there. They stood nearby, waiting to be asked. When they were asked, they nodded and began working without saying much. They were trusted to do simple tasks. They were not trusted with money or important things. They were given tools, but not expensive ones. They were given food, but not the best parts. They were given places to sleep, but not warm beds. They accepted what they were given without complaint. Children sometimes watched them from a distance. They saw how quiet they were, how they moved slowly and spoke even more slowly. Some children tried to talk to them, but most stopped after a few words. These men did not smile much. They did not tell jokes or play games. They only worked and then went away. Other grown-ups talked about them in low voices. They said these men were strong but not smart. They said they were used to hard work and did not ask for much. Some said they were lucky to have jobs at all. Others said they should be grateful for anything they were given. There were no big names for these men. No one wrote their stories down. No statues were built in their honor. They were not remembered in songs or poems. They were simply part of the city, like stones in the road or dust in the air. Sometimes, if a man worked well for many days, someone might call him by name. But most of the time, he was just you or the one over there. He did not mind. Names were not important. Work was what mattered. In the market, he stood near tables and waited for orders. He lifted baskets, carried jars, and swept the floor when told. Customers came and went. They looked at the goods, not at him. If they needed something, they asked the trader, not the helper. He stayed quiet and kept moving. At night, he sat near the fire and listened to others talk. He did not join in. He did not have much to say. His life was not filled with exciting things. It was filled with walking, carrying, sweeping, and waiting. He did not dream of becoming a leader or a soldier. Those dreams were for boys with fathers and homes. He only dreamed of quiet days and full stomachs. He dreamed of soft beds and warm cloaks. But mostly he dreamed of nothing at all. He did not feel shame. He did not feel pride. He simply was, like the wind that blew through the streets, like the rain that fell on the rooftops. He was there, and that was enough. People passed him every day and barely noticed. He was just another man in a city full of men. He did not stand out. He did not try to. Standing out brought questions. Questions led to talking. Talking was not always good. He kept his head down. He kept his mouth closed. He kept his feet moving. And so he went on, unnoticed and unremembered, like so many before him. This was how people saw these men. Not with hate, not with love, just with silence and passing glances. They were there. They worked, and they disappeared into the crowd again. Beliefs and stories about boys without parents. There were many stories about boys who had no parents. Some were told in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire was low and the wind moved slowly through the trees. Others were whispered in the corners of the market, where traders and workers sat and drank water or warm wine. These stories were not written down, but they were passed from one person to another, like smoke in the air. Some people believed that boys who had been left behind were touched by the gods. They said that the gods had a reason for letting the boys live when others might have died. Maybe they were meant for something important. Maybe they were meant to do hard work and suffer in silence. No one knew for sure, but the stories kept going. Others said that these boys were cursed. They believed that if a child was left by the road, it was because something was wrong. Maybe the stars had not been in the right place when the boy was born. Maybe his mother had done something wrong. Or maybe his father had made the gods angry. These people did not want to be near such boys for too long. They thought bad luck might follow. There were also stories about how the gods might watch over these boys. Some believed that a boy who had no home was watched by Mercury, the god of travelers and those who had no place to go. Others said that Juno, the mother of many gods, looked after them in secret. A few even thought that Mars, the god of war, had plans for some of them, and that one day they might become great soldiers. But most of the stories were not about gods. They were about what might happen to the boys as they grew. Some people said that boys who had been left behind would grow up to be strong, because they had learned to survive without help. They would not cry when they were hurt. They would not complain when they were tired. They would work harder than others and never ask for more. Other stories said the opposite. These boys, people said, would grow up with heavy hearts. They would not trust others. They would not love easily. They would not smile often. They would walk through life like shadows, quiet and unnoticed. They would not be remembered after they were gone. Sometimes, when a boy was taken in by a kind man, people talked. They said the man had done a good thing. They said the gods would see it and maybe give him more years to live. But others were not so sure. They said that a boy who had been left once might be left again. They said that bad luck could not be washed away by kindness alone. There were also stories about what happened to the mothers who left their boys. Some said they had no choice. They were poor and had nothing to give. They left their boys hoping someone better would find them. Others said the mothers had no heart. They turned away without looking back. And some said the mothers cried every night, but never went back to find their sons. The boys themselves did not hear most of these stories. They worked while others talked. They swept floors, carried water, and fed animals while the grown-ups sat near the fire and drank. But sometimes, when the wind was still and the night was quiet, they heard bits of what was said. They heard words like cursed, lucky, or strong. They did not understand all of it. They only knew their own lives. Some of the boys thought about the stories when they looked at the stars. They wondered if the gods really watched them. They wondered if they had a place in the world. They did not ask these questions out loud. Asking questions led to silence or punishment. So they thought them quietly and let the wind take the answers. There were no real answers, only stories, and stories could be told in many ways. Some said the boys were lucky. Others said they were not. But most of the time, no one said anything at all. The men who had once been boys did not think much about the stories either. They had lived through the days and nights. They had walked long roads and carried heavy loads. They had eaten little and slept less. They did not need stories to know who they were. They were simply there. Not heroes, not monsters, not chosen by the gods. Just men who had grown up without names and without homes. They did not dream of great things. They only dreamed of walking, of working, of staying warm at night. And so, the stories kept going even if the boys did not listen. Some said they were blessed. Some said they were cursed. But most of the time, no one said anything at all. Because in the end, the boys grew up. And the stories were left behind, like old clothes or broken sandals. Forgotten like so many things are. What life was like for them in their later years. As the years passed and the men grew older, their bodies began to change. Their backs ached more than before. Their legs did not move as quickly. Their hands were still strong, but they shook sometimes when they tried to hold small things. The work that once felt easy now took longer. They moved slower. They rested more often, and no one seemed to notice. The man who had taken them in long ago was gone now. Some had died quietly in their sleep. Others had grown too old to work and were cared for by someone else until they passed away. A few had simply disappeared one day, leaving behind only a few pieces of cloth and an empty space near the fire. Now these men worked for others or worked alone. Some stayed with the same farmer or builder for many years. Others moved from place to place, looking for jobs that would give them food and a place to sleep. There was no home waiting for them. There was no warm bed or soft blanket. Only the road, the sky, and the next day's work. They woke up later than they used to. Their eyes opened slowly. They sat up and stretched their arms, feeling the pain in their joints. They rubbed their faces and looked around. The room was dark. The fire had burned down to embers. The world outside was quiet. They got up and walked outside to wash their faces in cold water. They drank from a bowl and ate a small piece of bread left over from the night before. It was dry and hard, but it filled their stomachs enough to keep going. The work started early. They carried heavy baskets, dug deep holes, or swept dusty floors. Their movements were slower, but they were careful. They did not drop things like they used to. They lifted with both hands and stepped carefully so they would not fall. No one asked if they were tired. No one offered help. If they could do the work, they did it. If they could not, they were told there was always someone younger who could take their place. They did not talk much while working. Their voices were lower than before. Sometimes they forgot words and had to pause before speaking. When they did speak, people listened more closely. Not because they said anything important, but because they did not speak often. At midday, they sat on stones or leaned against walls while eating another small piece of bread or a few bites of fruit. They watched others pass by. Young boys running, traders calling out, women carrying baskets. These things had once been part of their lives too, but now they watched as if from far away. In the evenings, they sat near the fire and stared at the flames. They drank water or weak wine and did not say much. Other workers talked about the day's work, about what they hoped to do tomorrow, about dreams they might have. These older men listened but did not join in. They had no big dreams anymore. Their dreams were small. Dreams of warmth, of rest, of not waking up in pain. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they found a place where they could stay for a long time. A kind farmer gave them a corner to sleep in and let them eat with the others. A shopkeeper gave them a small job sweeping each morning in exchange for a bit of bread and a warm place to sit during the coldest days. But even this kindness did not last forever. Old age brought silence. It brought slow steps and tired eyes. It brought forgotten names and unseen faces. People still knew who these men were, but they did not ask them questions anymore. They did not need their help as much. There were younger men now, stronger and faster. These older men were watched with quiet respect, but also with distance. They remembered things from long ago. They remembered the first house they lived in. They remembered the man who had taken them in. They remembered the other boys who had come and gone. Some of those boys were gone forever. Some had died. Others had moved far away. Most had simply disappeared, like dust in the wind. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the fire was warm, they thought about their mothers. They did not remember faces or voices. They only remembered feelings. a hand on their head, a voice speaking softly, a moment of warmth before everything changed. They did not know if their mothers were still alive. They did not know if they ever thought of them. They did not cry when they thought these things. Crying was for boys. These men had learned long ago how to carry sadness without showing it. They kept their thoughts inside and their faces still. They dreamed less often now. When they did dream, it was not of adventure or glory. They dreamed of walking, of carrying things, of sweeping floors. They dreamed of standing still and waiting. They dreamed of silence and footsteps. They woke up and began again. There were no great endings for these men. No stories written about them. No songs sung in their honor. They simply lived, day after day, year after year. And then, one day, they did not wake up again. When they died, there was no ceremony. No crowd gathered. No speeches were made. Someone wrapped their body in cloth and carried it away. Someone said a quiet word to the gods. And then life went on, as if they had never been there at all. But sometimes, late at night, a younger worker would look at the fire and remember. He would remember the quiet man who taught him how to sweep without making noise. He would remember the old man who never smiled but always helped. He would remember the one who never spoke much but was always there. And for a short time, that memory would be enough. The quiet endings of many foundling lives, expanded version. The end came slowly for most of these men. It did not arrive with a loud cry or a final word. It came like the end of any day, quietly, without much notice. The sun rose as it always had. The sky was blue in some places and gray in others. The wind moved through the streets, touching walls, roofs, and empty corners. The city woke up again, as if nothing had changed. They woke up one morning and stood as they always had. They stretched their arms, rubbed their faces, and looked around the small space where they had slept. The fire was low. The air was cool. The world outside was still waking up. They sat for a moment before moving. They did not rush anymore. There was no need to. They moved slowly that day. Their steps were careful. Their hands held tools with more thought than before. They worked as they always had, sweeping, carrying, lifting, waiting. No one said anything about how tired they looked. No one asked if they needed to rest. If they could work, they did it. If they could not, someone else would take their place. That was how things were. At midday, they sat on stones or leaned against walls. They ate what they were given. They drank from shared bowls. They watched others move through the streets, but did not speak much. Talking took energy, and energy was something they no longer had in great amounts. They looked at the sky sometimes. The clouds passed by slowly. The birds flew in circles above. The sun stayed high for a while before beginning to fall again. As the sun began to fall, they felt the cold come in. Their backs ached more than usual. Their legs felt heavy. They finished their tasks and walked back to where they stayed. Some went to corners behind buildings. Others went to small rooms above shops or barns. A few had found places near fires where they could sleep close to others. They wrapped themselves in the same cloth they had used for many years. It was worn and thin, but it kept them warm enough. They closed their eyes and listened to the sounds of the night. The wind moving through the streets, the distant voices of people drinking wine, the soft footsteps of animals passing by. These sounds were familiar. They had heard them many times before. They did not dream often anymore. When they did, it was not of adventure or joy. They dreamed of walking, of carrying things, of standing still and waiting. They dreamed of silence and footsteps. They dreamed of days long ago when they were younger and stronger. They dreamed of places they had been and things they had done. But when they woke up, those dreams faded quickly. And then, one morning, they did not wake up. No one noticed at first. Someone called their name and waited for an answer. When there was none, they looked closer. The man was lying still, his face calm, his breathing gone. His hand rested near his chest. His eyes were closed. He looked like he was only sleeping, but he was not. There was no loud mourning. There was no gathering of people. Someone wrapped him in cloth and carried him away. Someone said a quiet word to the gods. Someone made sure he was buried where others had been laid to rest before him. There was no music. There was no dancing. There was no fire burning late into the night in his honor. No songs were sung. No stories were told. No one wrote down his name. If he had ever had one that mattered, it was forgotten now. His name had not been written in books. It had not been carved into stone. It had not been spoken often enough to be remembered. His tools were given to someone else. His space was filled by another man who needed a place to sleep. Life went on as it always had. The city did not stop. The market still opened. The workers still swept and carried and lifted. The world did not change because one more man had left it. Sometimes, late at night, someone remembered him. A worker might think of how he never spoke much but always did his share. A trader might remember how he never complained, even when the weather was cold. A farmer might recall how he worked until the last day. But those thoughts did not last long. The fire burned low. The wind moved through the streets. And soon, even the memory was gone. This was how many of these men ended their lives. Not with a story, not with a song, but with silence and stillness. They were born into nothing. They lived with little, and they left behind even less. They did not ask for greatness. They did not expect kindness. They only wanted to work, to eat, and to stay warm at night. And so they went on, one step at a time, until they could not take another. And then, finally, they rested. Forever. They had once been boys, left by the road or near the market. They had once been picked up by men who saw them and decided to bring them home. They had once learned how to sweep floors, carry water, and keep quiet when grown-ups were talking. They had once grown taller and stronger. They had once worked hard every day, doing what they were told without complaint. Now they were gone, not with a shout, not with a farewell, just gone. The city kept moving. The people kept working. The sun kept rising and falling. The stars kept shining over Rome. And the men who had once lived quiet lives were no longer there to see it. Their names had not been remembered. Their faces had not been drawn. Their voices had not been recorded. They had lived in the background of a city full of noise and color. They had been seen but not looked at. They had been known but not truly known. And yet they had been part of the city. They had helped build its roads, clean its streets, feed its people. They had stood in the shadows and done what needed to be done. They had lived and then they had died. That was all. Some people believed that the gods watched over such men. That even though no one remembered them, the gods did. That somewhere beyond the sky, past the stars and the winds, these men were given peace. That they were allowed to rest without pain, without work, without silence. Others believed that life simply ended. That when the breath was gone, so was everything else. That there were no gods watching, no rewards waiting, only stillness, only darkness, only the end. But no one knew for sure. The stories stopped here. The words ended here. And the silence returned. Because in the end, the boys grew up. And the men grew old. And then, one by one, they disappeared. Like dust in the wind. Like smoke in the air. Like footsteps in the sand after the tide comes in. And so they were gone. Not with a sound. Not with a tear. Not with a word. Only with silence. And that was enough. The mystery of Jack the Ripper. London in the late 1800s was a city of stark contrasts. The wealthy lived in comfort while the poor struggled daily in overcrowded slums. Nowhere was this divide more apparent than in Whitechapel, a district in the East End known for its poverty, crime, and desperation. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with dilapidated buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. At night, the flickering gas lamps created more shadows than light, providing perfect cover for those who wished to move unseen. The air carried a mix of unpleasant odors, the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and the ever-present smoke from countless coal fires. It was in this environment, during the autumn of 1888, that one of history's most infamous killers began his reign of terror. The man who would become known as Jack the Ripper emerged from these shadows without warning. His true identity remains unknown to this day, adding to the enduring mystery surrounding the case. What we do know is that he targeted women, specifically those who worked as prostitutes to survive in the harsh economic conditions of the time. His methods were particularly brutal, displaying knowledge of human anatomy that both horrified and puzzled investigators. The killer seemed to move through the streets like a ghost, striking suddenly before disappearing again into the night. The first confirmed murder attributed to the Ripper occurred on August 31st, 1888. The victim was Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman who had turned to prostitution after her marriage failed and she could find no other work. Her body was discovered in Bucks Row, now Durward Street, just before 4 o'clock in the morning by a carman on his way to work. The killing had been quick and efficient, with the murderer showing no hesitation in his brutal work. What shocked investigators most was the surgical precision of the wounds, suggesting the killer possessed some medical knowledge. The police initially hoped this would be an isolated incident, but they would soon be proven terribly wrong. Just 8 days later, on September 8th, another victim was found. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman with a tragic life story, was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her injuries were even more severe than those inflicted on Nichols, showing a clear escalation in violence. The killer had taken trophies from his victim, a behavior that would become part of his disturbing pattern. The small courtyard where Chapman was found became a site of morbid fascination, with crowds gathering to catch a glimpse of the crime scene despite police efforts to maintain order. As news of these murders spread, panic began to grip the Whitechapel area. Local newspapers, eager for sensational stories, printed increasingly dramatic accounts of the killings. The police found themselves under tremendous pressure to solve the case, but with few clues to work with and forensic science still in its infancy, their investigation moved slowly. The killer seemed to know the area intimately, choosing locations that provided quick escape routes and limited visibility. He struck at times when few reliable witnesses would be about, demonstrating careful planning in his selection of both victims and murder sites. The terror reached new heights on September 30th, when 2 more women were killed in what became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant, was found murdered in Dutfield's yard just before 1 o'clock in the morning. Unlike the previous victims, her injuries were less severe, leading some to speculate the killer had been interrupted. Just 45 minutes later and less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes became the Ripper's next victim in Mitre Square. The contrast between the 2 murders on the same night added to the growing confusion about the killer's methods and motives. The most brutal of all the killings occurred on November 9th, when Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in her small rented room at 13 Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims who were killed outdoors, Kelly was attacked in the relative privacy of her own home. The extent of the mutilations shocked even experienced police officers, with one reportedly fainting at the scene. This murder marked a significant departure from the killer's previous pattern and would be the last confirmed Ripper killing. During this period, the police and newspapers received numerous letters claiming to be from the killer. The most famous of these, the From Hell letter, arrived with a small box containing what appeared to be half of a human kidney. While some experts believe these communications were genuine, others argue they were hoaxes created by journalists or attention seekers. The uncertainty surrounding these letters only added to the growing mythology of Jack the Ripper. As suddenly as the killings began, they stopped. The lack of any clear resolution fueled endless speculation. Some theorized the killer had died or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes. Others believed he may have left the country or been committed to an asylum. The police investigation, hampered by the limitations of Victorian-era detective work, never identified a definitive suspect. Over time, hundreds of theories would emerge, pointing fingers at everyone from local butchers to members of the royal family, but none with conclusive evidence. The legacy of Jack the Ripper extends far beyond the 5 canonical victims. The case marked a turning point in how society viewed serial killers and how police conducted investigations. It exposed the terrible living conditions in London's slums and forced conversations about poverty and women's rights. The mystery has inspired countless books, films, and television shows, each offering their own interpretation of events. Modern forensic experts continue to examine the case, applying new technologies to old evidence in hopes of finally solving the mystery. What makes the Ripper case so enduring is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the complete absence of answers. In an age where we expect mysteries to be solved through science and technology, the idea that such horrific crimes could remain unsolved after more than a century is both fascinating and unsettling. The foggy streets of Victorian London may have concealed the killer's identity forever, ensuring that Jack the Ripper would remain history's most enigmatic murderer. The story continues to captivate because it represents the perfect unsolved mystery, one where we have just enough information to speculate endlessly, but not enough to reach any definitive conclusions. As long as people are fascinated by true crime and historical puzzles, the legend of Jack the Ripper will endure, his true identity perhaps lost to time but his crimes never forgotten. The victims, lives cut short by the Ripper's blade. The 5 women considered canonical victims of Jack the Ripper shared tragic similarities in their life circumstances. All were poor, struggling to survive in the harsh environment of London's East End, and all had turned to prostitution at various points as a means of subsistence. Their stories paint a bleak picture of Victorian England's underclass, where women with few options faced daily dangers just to secure food and shelter. Marion Nichols, the first confirmed victim, was born in 1845 and had been married with 5 children before her life spiraled into poverty. Her husband had divorced her due to her drinking problems, leaving her to fend for herself in the unforgiving streets of Whitechapel. On the night of August 31st, 1888, she was last seen trying to earn money for a bed in a common lodging house. Her body was discovered just hours later with horrific throat and abdominal wounds that would become the killer's signature. Annie Chapman, killed 8 days after Nichols, had been a respectable wife and mother before tuberculosis took her youngest child and alcoholism destroyed her marriage. By 1888, the 47-year-old was living in common lodging houses and selling flowers and matches when she couldn't earn enough through prostitution. Her murder showed increased brutality, with the killer removing organs and arranging her personal possessions neatly by her feet in a grotesque display. Elizabeth Stride's death during the double event of September 30th presents lingering questions. As a Swedish immigrant who spoke limited English, she had lived a transient life across Europe before settling in London. Some researchers believe her murder may have been interrupted, as her injuries were less extensive than other victims. The killer's subsequent attack on Catherine Eddowes that same night showed his determination to complete his gruesome work, with Eddowes suffering facial mutilations and organ removals. Mary Jane Kelly's murder on November 9th marked the most horrifying culmination of the killing spree. At about 25 years old, she was the youngest victim and the only one killed indoors. The destruction of her body was so complete that identification was only possible through personal effects. Her relative youth and the private nature of her murder have led to numerous theories about why she may have been specifically targeted. These women were more than just victims. They were individuals with complex lives, dreams, and relationships. The sensational focus on their deaths often overshadows their humanity. Polly Nichols had been known for her cheerful nature despite her circumstances. Annie Chapman was described as quiet and well-liked by neighbors. Elizabeth Stride had survived a shipwreck earlier in life. Catherine Eddowes maintained relationships with family members who genuinely cared for her. Mary Jane Kelly was reportedly planning to leave prostitution and start anew. The Ripper's choice of victims reveals much about Victorian society's vulnerabilities. These women moved through shadowy areas of the city where their disappearances wouldn't immediately alarm authorities. Their lifestyles made them easy targets for someone preying on society's marginalized members. Yet their murders forced London to confront the terrible conditions that drove women to such desperate existences. In death, these 5 women became unwilling symbols of both the dangers faced by the poor and the limitations of law enforcement to protect them. Their stories remind us that behind the sensationalized legend of Jack the Ripper lie real human tragedies, not just in their violent ends, but in the difficult lives that made them vulnerable in the first place. The true horror extends beyond the murders themselves to the societal failures that allowed such crimes to occur and remain unsolved. The investigation, police efforts, and obstacles. The Whitechapel murders presented unprecedented challenges for London's Metropolitan Police and the separate City of London Police Force. Victorian detective methods, still in their relative infancy, proved woefully inadequate against a killer who left minimal evidence and operated with chilling efficiency. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional issues, public hysteria, and the limitations of forensic science in the 1880s. When the first murders occurred, the police initially treated them as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. This approach changed after Annie Chapman's murder, when similarities to Mary and Nichols' killing became impossible to ignore. Scotland Yard assigned Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, familiar with Whitechapel's criminal underworld, to lead the investigation. His team conducted hundreds of interviews and followed numerous leads, but each promising avenue eventually led to dead ends. The crime scenes themselves offered little useful evidence. Without modern forensic techniques like fingerprinting or blood analysis, detectives relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, most of which proved unreliable. The foggy, gaslit streets of Whitechapel made positive identifications nearly impossible, and many potential witnesses were hesitant to come forward, either from fear of the killer or distrust of police. One significant obstacle was the sheer volume of false confessions and misleading tips. The sensational newspaper coverage inspired countless attention seekers to claim responsibility or offer dubious information. Officers wasted valuable time pursuing leads from psychic visions, drunken boasts, and outright hoaxes. Even more serious suspects, like the notorious Leather Apron, a local oddjobber who intimidated prostitutes, were eventually cleared of involvement. The police conducted several innovative efforts for their time. They photographed crime scene evidence, surveyed local slaughterhouses for suspects with anatomical knowledge, and even consulted physicians about the killer's possible medical training. Some officers went undercover as potential targets, walking the streets at night in hopes of drawing out the murderer. These attempts showed remarkable dedication but ultimately failed to produce results. Perhaps the investigation's greatest weakness was the lack of coordination between police divisions. The Metropolitan Police and City Police operated independently, sometimes withholding information from each other due to institutional rivalry. This bureaucratic inefficiency may have allowed crucial connections between crimes to be overlooked in the investigation's early stages. As public pressure mounted, the Home Office offered a pardon to any accomplice who would come forward with information, an unprecedented move that yielded nothing. The police commissioner eventually resigned amid criticism of his handling of the case. By the time the killings stopped, the investigation had involved over 2,000 interviews, 300 suspects, and 80 detained individuals, yet no conclusive evidence against any single perpetrator. The Ripper case exposed fundamental flaws in Victorian law enforcement. It prompted reforms in police communication, forensic documentation, and investigative techniques that would shape modern detective work. While the Metropolitan Police were widely criticized at the time, modern analysts recognized they were simply unequipped to handle such an unusual criminal. The killer's ability to evade capture spoke less to police incompetence than to his understanding of the era's investigative limitations and the dark corners of a society that allowed his crimes to go unpunished. The letters, taunting clues or cruel hoaxes. During the investigation into the Whitechapel murders, the police and newspapers received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. These communications varied greatly in tone and content, ranging from rambling nonsense to disturbingly specific accounts of the crimes. The most famous of these, the Dear Boss letter dated September 25, 1888, first used the name Jack the Ripper and threatened further violence. This name would become forever associated with the case, regardless of whether the letter was genuine or not. The handwriting in these letters showed significant variation, suggesting multiple authors. Some contained details about the murders that had not been made public, while others clearly copied information already printed in newspapers. Police handwriting experts of the time lacked modern analytical techniques and could not definitively determine if any letters came from the actual killer. Many showed signs of being written by educated individuals, contradicting early theories that the murderer was an uneducated local. The From Hell letter, postmarked October 15, 1888, stood out for its particularly disturbing content. Accompanying the letter was a small box said to contain half of a human kidney preserved in wine. Medical examination suggested it might have come from Catherine Eddowes, whose body had shown evidence of a kidney removal. However, even this potentially crucial piece of evidence proved inconclusive, as the kidney could have been obtained from medical specimens available to students or doctors. Newspapers of the time played a complicated role in the letter phenomenon. Eager for sensational content, some publications printed full transcripts of the most dramatic letters, potentially inspiring copycats. This media frenzy created a feedback loop where each new letter received extensive coverage, encouraging more hoaxers to participate. Police complained that valuable investigative time was wasted chasing false leads generated by these publicity seekers. Modern forensic analysis has cast doubt on nearly all the Ripper letters. Linguistic examination reveals that several show similarities to newspaper phrasing of the time, suggesting they were composed by journalists or readers familiar with press coverage. The few letters that contained potentially authentic details could have been written by someone with access to police information rather than the killer himself. The lasting impact of these letters extends beyond their questionable authenticity. They shaped public perception of the killer as someone intelligent, mocking, and aware of his growing notoriety. This image of a taunting, media-savvy murderer would influence how future serial killers communicated with authorities and the press. The letters also demonstrated how quickly myth could blend with fact in high-profile criminal cases, a phenomenon that continues in modern true crime reporting. Despite numerous analyses over the decades, no consensus exists about whether any authentic Ripper letters were received. They remain historical curiosities that tell us more about Victorian media culture and public fascination with crime than about the killer's true identity. The very existence of so many fake letters speaks to the extraordinary hold the case had on the public imagination, even as the murders were occurring. The suspects, endless theories, few answers. Over 200 suspects have been proposed in the Jack the Ripper case throughout the years, ranging from plausible to utterly fantastical. Victorian police focused their attention on several primary suspects during the original investigation, none of whom could be conclusively linked to the crimes. As decades passed, amateur sleuths and professional researchers alike would add countless names to this list, often based on flimsy evidence or wild speculation. One early suspect was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who committed suicide shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. His family suspected he might be the killer, and this private suspicion eventually reached police ears. While the timing of his death is intriguing, no concrete evidence connects him to the crimes, and his supposed medical knowledge appears to have been exaggerated by later theorists. Another frequently mentioned suspect is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who was institutionalized for mental illness. Contemporary police files indicate he was seriously considered by some investigators, but again, no definitive proof linked him to the murders. The suggestion that he was identified by an eyewitness but not prosecuted because the witness refused to testify against a fellow Jew remains unverified. The royal conspiracy theories represent some of the most elaborate and unlikely suspect scenarios. These suggest the killer was either Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, or someone acting to cover up his alleged secret marriage. The theory posits that high-level government interference protected the real murderer. While this makes for dramatic storytelling, historians have found no credible evidence to support such claims, which appear to have originated decades after the murders. More plausible suspects include several doctors or medical students known to frequent Whitechapel. The killer's apparent anatomical knowledge supports this line of thinking. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with misogynistic tendencies, was investigated by police but fled England before being thoroughly questioned. Similarly, George Chapman, born Severin Klosowski, was a Polish barber surgeon who later poisoned 3 wives in London. While his methods differed from the Rippers, his medical background and violent nature make him an interesting candidate. Modern profiling suggests the killer was likely a local resident familiar with Whitechapel's geography, possibly someone who blended into the working-class environment. He may have had some medical training through military service or apprenticeship rather than formal education. The abrupt end to the killings could indicate his death, imprisonment on unrelated charges, or institutionalization, though some researchers argue the canonical 5 victims may not represent his complete tally. The suspect list continues to grow even today, with recent years seeing names like Charles Lechmere, a Carman who found 1 victim's body, and Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's lover, proposed as potential killers. DNA evidence recovered from a shawl allegedly connected to Catherine Eddowes has been used to suggest Aaron Kosminski's guilt, but this evidence remains controversial among researchers. What becomes clear when examining Ripper suspects is how little concrete evidence exists against any of them. Most theories rely on circumstantial connections or subjective interpretations of historical documents. The passage of time has only muddied the waters, allowing for increasingly speculative accusations against historical figures who can no longer defend themselves. This lack of resolution ensures the suspect debate will continue indefinitely, with each generation proposing new candidates while reevaluating old ones. Cultural impact: how the Ripper changed society. The Jack the Ripper case marked a turning point in how society viewed violent crime, media coverage of murders, and urban poverty. The extensive newspaper reporting created one of the first true crime media frenzies, establishing patterns still seen in modern coverage of serial killers. The graphic details published in Victorian papers, while shocking by today's standards, revealed a public appetite for sensational crime stories that would only grow stronger in the following century. Whitechapel itself became forever associated with the murders, its name synonymous with danger and mystery. The district's poverty and overcrowding, briefly thrust into the spotlight, became subjects of social reform debates. While conditions gradually improved in subsequent decades, the area carried the stigma of the Ripper crimes for generations. Ironically, the notoriety eventually transformed parts of Whitechapel into tourist attractions, with guided walks and museum exhibits capitalizing on the bloody history. The case influenced police procedure and forensic science development. The investigative failures highlighted the need for better coordination between police divisions, more systematic evidence collection, and improved autopsy documentation. While fingerprinting wouldn't become standard practice until the early 1900s, the Ripper investigation demonstrated the limitations of relying on eyewitness accounts and confessions without physical evidence. Literature and popular culture quickly adopted the Ripper mythology. Early fictionalized accounts appeared in penny dreadfuls and stage plays within years of the murders. As cinema developed, numerous films used the Ripper premise, from Hitchcock's 1927 The Lodger to more graphic modern interpretations. The mysterious killer archetype, intelligent, elusive, and taunting authorities, owes much to the Ripper legend, influencing characters from Sherlock Holmes villains to contemporary horror antagonists. The murders also impacted women's lives in Victorian England. While the victims were marginalized individuals, the brutality of their deaths sparked discussions about women's safety and economic vulnerability. Some historians argue the case indirectly supported arguments for better social services and protections for poor women, though meaningful reforms would take decades to materialize. Academic interest in the case has produced an entire field of Ripperology, with researchers publishing thousands of books and articles examining every conceivable aspect of the crimes. Conferences and journals dedicated to Ripper studies continue to thrive, demonstrating the enduring fascination with this unsolved mystery. Modern forensic experts have applied DNA analysis, geographic profiling, and psychological assessment techniques to the old evidence, though no breakthrough has definitively solved the case. The tourism industry surrounding Ripper sites presents an ethical dilemma. While the murders occurred over 130 years ago, some question the appropriateness of commercializing real human tragedy. Walking tours pass by locations where women suffered horrific deaths, often with theatrical retellings that prioritize entertainment over historical accuracy or respect for the victims. This tension between memorialization and exploitation continues to spark debate among historians and community members. Perhaps the most significant cultural impact has been how the Ripper case shaped our understanding of serial killers. Before these murders, society lacked the framework to comprehend repeated, seemingly motiveless killings. The Ripper investigations helped establish patterns that would later inform criminal psychology and profiling. The very term serial killer owes something to the Victorian public's horrified fascination with this unprecedented type of criminal. Unsolved mysteries, lingering questions. Despite countless investigations over 13 decades, fundamental questions about the Jack the Ripper case remain unanswered. The most obvious, the killer's identity, may never be conclusively determined due to the passage of time and loss of original evidence. However, numerous other mysteries continue to puzzle researchers and fuel debate among ripperologists. One persistent question involves the exact number of victims. Police originally investigated 11 murders in Whitechapel between 1888 to 1891, but only 5 Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly are universally accepted as Ripper killings. Some researchers argue for including earlier or later murders that show similarities in method or victimology. The canonical 5 designation itself is somewhat arbitrary, based on a police official's later memorandum rather than contemporary investigative consensus. The killer's medical knowledge remains another point of contention. While some wounds suggest anatomical familiarity, other aspects appear crude or inconsistent. This has led to theories ranging from the murderer being a trained surgeon to someone with butchering experience or even self-taught anatomical knowledge from medical textbooks. The varying precision between victims also raises questions about whether the killer's skill improved with practice or if some mutilations were performed in haste. Geographic profiling reveals interesting patterns about the murder locations. All occurred within a compact area easily navigable on foot, suggesting the killer lived or worked nearby. However, the choice of specific sites, some relatively exposed, others more secluded, doesn't follow an obvious logic. Researchers debate whether these locations held personal significance for the killer or were simply convenient opportunities. The abrupt end to the murders presents another enigma. After Mary Jane Kelly's exceptionally brutal killing in November 1888, the recognized Ripper-style attacks ceased. Possible explanations include the killer's death, imprisonment for other offenses, institutionalization, or relocation. Some theorists suggest he may have continued killing elsewhere under different methods, though no compelling evidence supports this. Modern analysis has questioned whether all 5 canonical murders were committed by the same hand. Elizabeth Stride's less severe injuries have led some to propose she was killed by a different assailant, making the September 30th double event potentially unrelated crimes. Others point to differences in methodology between victims as suggesting multiple killers copying each other's work. The police files, while extensive, contain frustrating gaps. Important documents were lost over time or damaged in World War II bombings. Some investigators' private notes suggest they had strong suspicions about certain individuals, but left these out of official reports. The reasons for these omissions, whether protecting influential figures or simply avoiding libel, remain speculative. Forensic re-examinations in recent decades have produced more questions than answers. DNA testing on surviving evidence has yielded inconclusive or contested results. The famous Ripper Diary, purportedly written by suspect James Maybrick, was declared a hoax by most experts, demonstrating how modern technology can sometimes complicate rather than clarify historical mysteries. Perhaps the most profound unanswered question is why this particular case continues to captivate when other unsolved murders have faded from memory. The combination of Victorian atmosphere, gruesome details, media sensationalism, and complete lack of resolution creates a perfect storm of enduring fascination. As each generation applies its newest investigative techniques to the old evidence, the Ripper mystery evolves while remaining essentially unsolvable, a historical puzzle that continues to resist final answers. Conclusion: the enduring shadow of Whitechapel. Break time equals 2s/. The Jack the Ripper case represents more than just a series of unsolved murders. It embodies the perfect historical mystery, combining gruesome crime, investigative failure, media sensationalism, and enduring fascination. The break time equals 2s/. Over a century after the last killing, the case continues to generate books, documentaries, scholarly papers, and tourist attractions, demonstrating an unparalleled cultural longevity. Break time equals 3s/. What makes these crimes so persistently intriguing is their resistance to resolution. Break time equals 2s/. In an age where forensic science can solve decades-old cold cases, the Ripper murders remain stubbornly opaque. Break time equals 2s/. The lack of definitive answers creates a vacuum filled by endless speculation, allowing each generation to reinterpret the evidence through contemporary lenses. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The case serves as a Rorschach test of sorts, revealing more about the theorist's times and preoccupations than about Victorian London. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The victims themselves often become overshadowed by the mythology surrounding their killer. Break time equals 2s forward slash Mary and Nichols. Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were real women with complex lives, not merely props in a sensational drama. Break time equals 2s forward slash modern retellings increasingly attempt to restore their humanity, focusing on the societal conditions that made them vulnerable rather than just the brutality of their deaths. Break time equals 3s forward slash. From a criminological perspective, the case marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached serial murders. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The investigative failures spurred reforms in police communication, evidence preservation, and forensic documentation. Break time equals 2s forward slash. While these changes came too late to catch the Ripper, they established protocols that would help solve future cases. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The murders also demonstrated the dangers of media interference in criminal investigations, a lesson still relevant today. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The ethical dimensions of Ripper tourism and commercialization continue to provoke discussion. Break time equals 2s forward slash. While the murders occurred long enough ago to fall into historical study rather than living memory, questions remain about appropriate ways to memorialize such events. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The growing emphasis on victim-centered narratives suggests a gradual shift toward more respectful commemoration. Break time equals 3s forward slash. Technological advances offer slim hope for new breakthroughs, though each purported solution so far has failed to gain universal acceptance. Break time equals 2s forward slash. Even if conclusive DNA evidence someday identifies a suspect, the circumstantial nature of such proof may never satisfy all researchers. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The Ripper's true identity may ultimately matter less than what the case reveals about society's enduring fascination with the macabre and unexplained. Break time equals 3s forward slash. As long as people remain captivated by true crime and historical puzzles, Jack the Ripper will maintain his place as the ultimate bogeyman, a shadowy figure representing our deepest fears about random violence and the limits of justice. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The foggy streets of 1888 Whitechapel continue to obscure the truth, ensuring that history's most infamous serial killer will keep his secrets indefinitely. Break time equals 3s forward slash. The case's true legacy may be how it demonstrates the power of unsolved mystery to capture human imagination across generations. Break time equals 2s forward slash. In our information-saturated age, where answers are usually just a search engine query away, the Ripper murders remain tantalizingly opaque, a reminder that some historical truths may be permanently lost to time, no matter how advanced our investigative methods become. We now occupy the central place in the picture of crime in England at the end of the 19th century. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 did not occur in isolation, but rather emerged from the complex social fabric of late Victorian England, where crime was as much a part of daily life as the ever-present coal smoke that blanketed London's streets. The break time equals 2s forward slash. To understand the environment that allowed such brutal crimes to go unsolved, one must examine the broader landscape of law enforcement, urban poverty, and societal attitudes that characterized this pivotal period in British history. The break time equals 2s forward slash. The relationship between crime and society during these years reveals much about the challenges facing a nation undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization, where traditional methods of maintaining order struggled to keep pace with the changing times. Break time equals 3s forward slash. Policing in London during the late 19th century represented an uneasy balance between modern reform and outdated practices. Break time equals 2s forward slash. The Metropolitan Police Force, established in 1829, had brought some measure of organization to law enforcement, yet remained woefully understaffed for a city that had grown to contain over 5 million inhabitants by the 1880s. Break time equals 2s / constables walked their beats in distinctive uniforms designed to make them easily visible as symbols of authority, but their presence could hardly cover every alley and courtyard of the sprawling metropolis. Break time equals 2s / the separate city of London police maintained jurisdiction over the historic Square Mile at London's heart, creating occasional tensions and confusion between the two forces that would later hamper the Ripper investigation. Break time equals 2s / most officers came from working-class backgrounds themselves, with limited education and training that focused more on maintaining public order than solving complex crimes. Break time equals 3s / the daily reality of police work involved dealing with drunkenness, petty theft, and domestic disturbances far more often than confronting dangerous criminals. Break time equals 2s / officers carried only a wooden truncheon for protection, with firearms being strictly reserved for special circumstances. Break time equals 2s / this lack of weaponry reflected both the general peacefulness of most police interactions and the Victorian ideal of policing by consent rather than force. Break time equals 2s / however, it also left constables vulnerable when facing truly violent offenders. Break time equals 2s / the absence of any formal detective training for most of the century meant that investigative techniques remained rudimentary, relying heavily on local knowledge and informants rather than systematic evidence collection. Break time equals 2s / only in 1878 did the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, form within the Metropolitan Police, creating a small corps of plainclothes detectives who would later work on the Ripper case. Break time equals 3s / crime statistics from the period, while incomplete by modern standards, reveal patterns that help contextualize the Whitechapel murders. Break time equals 2s / property offenses accounted for the vast majority of recorded crimes, with theft of various sorts being overwhelmingly common. Break time equals 2s / violent crimes made up a much smaller portion of overall offenses, though they naturally received disproportionate attention in the press. Break time equals 2s / murder remained relatively rare in statistical terms, with London recording between 20 to 50 homicides annually during the 1880s, a rate that would seem astonishingly low by modern urban standards. Break time equals 2s / what made the Ripper killings so shocking was not just their brutality, but their violation of the generally held belief that murder was typically a domestic affair, committed between people who knew each other, not a random predator stalking strangers in the night. Break time equals 3s / the court system of Victorian England moved with a ponderous solemnity that often failed to match the realities of urban crime. Break time equals 2s / magistrates handled minor offenses with swift efficiency, while more serious cases progressed through a series of increasingly formal proceedings. Break time equals 2s / the introduction of the Penal Servitude Act in 1853 had reduced the number of offenses punishable by death, though capital punishment remained for murder until 1861. Break time equals 2s / transportation to Australia had once served as an alternative to execution, but this practice ended in 1868, leaving imprisonment as the primary punishment for serious crimes. Break time equals 2s / the prison system itself underwent reforms during this period, moving away from the purely punitive models of earlier decades toward systems emphasizing discipline and hard labor. Break time equals 2s / notable figures like Elizabeth Fry had campaigned for improved prison conditions, though facilities remained grim by any modern standard. Break time equals 3s / the economic underpinnings of crime in Victorian England cannot be overstated. Break time equals 2s / the Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth for some while leaving many others in precarious circumstances. Break time equals 2s / periodic economic downturns like the Long Depression beginning in 1873 pushed more people into poverty and desperation. Break time equals 2s / unemployment fluctuated wildly in industrial areas, and the absence of any social safety net meant that losing one's job could quickly lead to destitution. Break time equals 2s / for many, petty crime became not a choice but a necessity for survival. Break time equals 2s children as young as 5 or 6 might be sent out to beg or steal to contribute to family income, beginning patterns of criminal behavior that often continued into adulthood. Break time equals 2s the workhouse system, intended as a last resort for the destitute, was so feared that many preferred the risks of crime to submitting to its harsh regime. Break time equals 3s. The physical environment of London itself facilitated certain types of criminal activity. Break time equals 2s. The rapid growth of the city had outpaced urban planning, resulting in a maze of narrow streets, blind alleys, and interconnected courtyards that provided both homes for the poor and hiding places for criminals. Break time equals 2s. Sanitation remained primitive in many areas, with open sewers and shared privies still common in poorer districts. Break time equals 2s. Lighting varied greatly by neighborhood. Wealthy areas might have gas lamps at regular intervals, while poorer sections relied on sporadic lighting or moonlight. Break time equals 2s. This patchwork of illumination created shadows where all manner of illicit activities could flourish unseen. Break time equals 2s. The famous London fog, a combination of natural weather patterns and industrial pollution, further obscured movement and identity during much of the year. Break time equals 3s. Public attitudes toward crime were shaped by both personal experience and increasingly sensational newspaper reporting. Break time equals 2s. The expansion of literacy and the reduction of newspaper taxes had created a booming popular press that fed the public's appetite for crime stories. Break time equals 2s. Penny papers like the Illustrated Police News provided lurid accounts of criminal cases accompanied by dramatic woodcut illustrations. Break time equals 2s. This coverage tended to exaggerate both the frequency and danger of violent crime, creating moral panics that often had little basis in statistical reality. Break time equals 2s. The middle and upper classes viewed crime as primarily a problem of the lower orders, failing to recognize how their own business practices and political decisions contributed to the conditions that fostered criminal behavior. Break time equals 3s. The professional criminal class occupied an ambiguous position in Victorian society. Break time equals 2s. While burglars and thieves were universally condemned, some figures like the burglar Charles Peace achieved a strange sort of celebrity status. Break time equals 2s. Fences operated openly in certain districts, knowingly purchasing stolen goods for resale. Break time equals 2s. Organized criminal networks existed, though they were less sophisticated than their modern counterparts. Break time equals 2s. The most successful criminals often maintained respectable fronts, moving between the underworld and legitimate society with ease. Break time equals 2s. Corruption among certain police officers and public officials provided further avenues for criminal enterprise to flourish, though outright institutional corruption was less common than individual officers turning a blind eye for personal gain. Break time equals 3s. The relationship between crime and social reform in Victorian England was complex and often contradictory. Break time equals 2s. On one hand, reformers pointed to criminal statistics as evidence of the need for improved housing, education, and working conditions. Break time equals 2s. On the other, hardline attitudes emphasizing punishment over prevention dominated much of the political discourse. Break time equals 2s. Philanthropic organizations established ragged schools and missions to uplift the poor, while simultaneously many in positions of power believed that poverty and crime resulted from moral failings rather than systemic issues. Break time equals 2s. This tension between reform and repression characterized much of the period's approach to social problems, with neither side achieving clear dominance. Break time equals 3s. The role of alcohol in Victorian crime cannot be ignored. Break time equals 2s. Public drunkenness accounted for a significant portion of police arrests, and many violent crimes occurred under the influence of alcohol. Break time equals 2s. Gin palaces and public houses proliferated in working-class districts, offering temporary escape from grim living conditions. Break time equals 2s temperance movements gained momentum throughout the century, arguing that alcohol was both a cause and consequence of poverty and crime. Break time equals 2s licensing laws attempted to control the worst excesses of public drinking, but enforcement was inconsistent and illegal drinking establishments flourished in areas where police presence was light. Break time equals 3s gender played a significant role in both the perpetration and experience of crime during this period. Break time equals 2s most recorded offenders were male, though women certainly participated in criminal activities, particularly theft, prostitution, and receiving stolen goods. Break time equals 2s the legal system often treated female offenders more leniently than their male counterparts, except in cases involving moral transgressions that violated Victorian ideals of proper womanhood. Break time equals 2s women also frequently found themselves victims of crime, both in domestic settings and public spaces. Break time equals 2s the vulnerability of poor women, in particular, was extreme with few legal protections against exploitation or violence. Break time equals 3s the technological limitations of Victorian crime investigation become painfully apparent when examining cases like the Ripper murders. The break time equals 2s without fingerprinting, forensic analysis, or even reliable means of recording crime scene details. Detectives relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, notoriously unreliable under the best circumstances. Break time equals 2s the preservation of evidence was haphazard at best, with no standardized procedures for handling or storing potential clues. Break time equals 2s communication between police districts was slow and inefficient, relying on physical messengers rather than any sort of instant communication. Break time equals 2s these limitations meant that even determined investigators often found themselves stymied by the basic logistical challenges of coordinating information across a large, crowded city. Break time equals 3s the legacy of Victorian crime and punishment continues to influence modern systems in ways both obvious and subtle. Break time equals 2s many contemporary police procedures trace their origins to reforms implemented in response to 19th century challenges. Break time equals 2s the tension between punitive and rehabilitative approaches to criminal justice remains unresolved. Break time equals 2s urban poverty, while less extreme than in Victorian times, still correlates strongly with criminal activity. Break time equals 2s perhaps most significantly, the sensationalization of crime in media has only intensified since the days of penny dreadfuls and illustrated police news, shaping public perceptions in ways that often distort statistical realities. Break time equals 3s when considering the Whitechapel murders within this broader context, they emerge not as an inexplicable anomaly, but as the most extreme manifestation of systemic issues plaguing Victorian society. Break time equals 2s the killer's ability to evade capture speaks as much to the limitations of contemporary policing as to his own cunning. Break time equals 2s the vulnerability of his victims reflects the precarious position of poor women in the social hierarchy. Break time equals 2s the media frenzy surrounding the case previewed modern true crime obsessions. Break time equals 2s and the enduring mystery of the killer's identity continues to fascinate precisely because it represents the ultimate cold case, one where the passage of time has only deepened rather than resolved the questions surrounding those terrible autumn nights in 1888.